We reconvene for Liberty Conspiracy Live here on Rokfin, on Rumble, on YouTube, and on Twitter/X, and on X itself. Good to have you here, everybody. I'm LG Grande. Whatever time zone you call home, we are extant, and we are enjoying a beautiful day. I hope you're enjoying a beautiful day. We here at The Conspiracy welcome you to the larger group, the cabal, as we plot and plan and crouch and conspire Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock, breaking apart the news stories of the day to derive sustaining information and knowledge and learning and morals and economic history, as well as some wisdom, hopefully, going back and forth from the news stories of the day so that we can carry that intellectual ammunition with us to future stories and apply that information and that wisdom to those other stories. It's good to have you here, everybody. You might know my work from MRC TV. And if you're finding me because of that, thank you for doing so. Typically, that comes through X. So thank you. That is at Gard Goldsmith on X. And as we go through the news stories, you'll find almost all these stories corresponding to my daily feed at X, so that if you see the information in video live while you're watching, you can comment on it, and you can go back into my X feed and you can find those articles that I've mentioned here on the show. And if you're watching after the fact and you want to share any of the information that I provide in this stream, you can pause it at YouTube, you can pause it at Rumble, and you can share it at that point, at that time code with friends. If you say, you know what, I think this might be one that my friend or my loved one might find very interesting or infuriating or something like that, but hopefully to derive some long-standing evergreen lessons for liberty out of these things. Good to have you here. In honor of my parents who helped train me on the libertarian side of things, I welcome you to the larger panoply of libertarian philosophy, going all the way into anarchism, individual ownership, self-ownership, and no human ruler, which is the way things are supposed to be under God. That is all. And we are all granted natural rights by God. Let's get into how some of those news stories from the day and from the weekend correspond to that eternal lesson as we look at what's on tap tonight for Liberty Conspiracy 62424, my friends. Yeah, 2x4, 5x5. We'll check in with chat in just a minute and see what's happening there. Tonight on the program, everybody, on this beautiful 24th day of June 2024. My goodness, what a great, great summer it's been so far here in southern New Hampshire. The big story will open our show, not the news flash. The big story is the Ukraine-U.S. killing of Russian beachgoers and the Russian government demanding an audience with U.S. ministers, plus all of the nuances that have to do with that, and the additional story of the terrorist attack inside Russia that seems to have been inspired, again, by Western influence, trying to drum up some sort of dissent between people inside Russia and make a scapegoat out of Islamic forces when it is probably the Americans using their great CIA connections involved in it. We'll talk about that. Plus, we'll get into remembering McCain's lies at this very important time that is seeing the United States directly, kinetically involved with killing Russian civilians. We'll also talk about Israeli attacks on UN volunteers, the Israeli attacks on Lebanon, the West Bank, and strapping an injured Palestinian to a vehicle as if their already extant war crimes and genocide weren't enough. They've got that on video as well. Then we'll look at the other big story, the massive story that I didn't get to cover Friday afternoon. It broke, and we're going to cover it. I got to write on it this weekend in a massive 1,600-word piece for MRC TV, and I got to shoot a video for it today. It's about 12 minutes long. It covers a lot of the details of the Supreme Court's Rahimi decision. The Supreme Court backing gun grabs without due process or any conviction of a crime. And of course, the conviction is supposed to come after due process. Then we'll have our news flash. It's the solar panel invasion College Trump Green Card edition of the News Flash, and we'll get your thoughts from the conspiracy. Yes, let's see who's in the conspiracy right now. I want to welcome all of you who are watching on X. And remember, if you want to comment on X, you can do so. I can see your comments thanks to the StreamYard program that I use to stream. And if you're watching on X, please do me a favor, hit the thumbs up and all that stuff, and recycle it. And if you're having a tough time recycling, just go back into my X feed at Gard Goldsmith. You'll see the feed inside my feed. You'll see the live show going on, and then you can hit that and recycle that very easily, and then jump onto that and then get back into the comments section. Very simple, very easy, as Shiftel used to say on Evening Magazine. Over in Rokfin, my main man, Jason Barker, is there. He is, of course, the man from the foxhole. He is the man behind Knights of the Storm. Anarchy Andrew is there. Hello, Andrew. Good to have you here, buddy. Great to hear from you and get some really good positive vibes from you over the weekend, man. I hope everything's going great, great, great for you and yours, my man. And I'm glad you made it up to Pork Fest for a little while. I was hoping to make it Friday. Didn't make it Friday. Hoping to make it Saturday. Didn't make it Saturday either. And it turned out that both decisions were very wise decisions. And I still got to soak in the vibe from a lot of the good people who were up there and watch some of the things that were happening. So it was great. And Nancy Chambers, I was thinking about you this afternoon, Nancy. Good evening to you and to all. Harry Hart is there as well inside Rokfin. Hey, if you ever are watching and you wonder about, hey, should I join some of the crowd during the chat or whatever, do so. You're going to love any of the groups inside Rumble or Rokfin. They're awesome people. Oftentimes they go both ways, as the Scarecrow would say, into both chat rooms. And I want to say hi to the folks at Rumble right now as well. Inside the Rumble chat, we've got a lot of cool folks. I want to welcome first off, looks like I'm not seeing what's going on in Rumble right now. I'll wait, and I'll give you my greetings in just a minute. I know there are a number of people watching, but right now the chat screen is blank, so I'll recycle it and see what I can find as I make myself big as the team makes me small on the screen to once more look at our schedule. And don't forget, if you want to drop your thoughts in the conspiracy, that is great. And we're going to have some unofficial members of the conspiracy in video tonight. I also want to thank David Knight for doing a great job today on some of the breaking news, especially on this Ukraine story about the Russian beachgoers. Just phenomenal coverage of so many different issues. And I really appreciate what he's been doing. It's just excellent. And Harry, thank you. Thank you, Harry, for saying hello. Great to see you there. All right, my friends, it's time for us to get started on this amazing summer night. Not a hot August night, as Neil Diamond might say, but a very, very busy night. By the way, I just got Neil Diamond's most recent record with Rick Rubin, and I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, but I'm looking forward to that. I'm really looking forward to that. All right, everybody, you know what it's time for. It's time for us to check in with Joe Piscopo and find out about, you got it, everybody, the big story.
The big story, the big story, the big story, the big story.
Yes, the big story. And what's it going to be? Well, it's going to be, of course, about the kinetic action in which the United States has been involved for a long time, but now directly tied to the United States because it took United States skilled workers to be able to make that thing operate, the ATACMS missile filled with cluster munitions. We're talking a little theme from Edwin Starr.
Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Say it again, y'all. Look out.
I can't even imagine having a voice this good. This is so great. And then he rips into it.
I despise, 'cause it means destruction of innocent lives.
Oh, yeah. Destruction of innocent lives. Boy, oh boy, is that a sad, sad theme for the entire weekend. Just unbelievable. As we enjoy summertime, they pull our money and money from future generations through tax enslavement and fund the weapons manufacturers. This particular ATACMS seems to have been made by Lockheed Martin. They picked up the company that originally made those weapons. I was looking up some of the background on the ATACMS missiles. They picked up the company. They bought out that original company. So it's Lockheed Martin. Oh, wonderful, Lockheed. Great. That sure is for U.S. defense, huh? Yeah, blowing up innocent beachgoers. Just great. Fantabulastic. Let's check out what Gerald Celente had to say. And I will, of course, offer some approximations of some of Gerald's language. You know, he can get very colorful. He says, huge post from Russia. This is real. The first person I saw was Che from Moscow Mules write about this. But he says, Gerald, this is real. The U.S. will not continue to be unscathed. Wake the F up. Demand that little clown boy Zelensky ends this war before we die in a nuclear exchange. Here's the Russian embassy, their official information on the 23rd, yesterday, as people tried to enjoy their summertime. 5 people, including 3 children, killed and 124 civilians were injured as a result of the Ukrainian armed forces' attack on Sevastopol. Russian MOD, Ministry of Defense, says today at 12:15, a terrorist missile strike by 5 U.S.-made ATACMS operational tactical missiles equipped by cluster warheads was deliberately delivered at Sevastopol. The American specialists input all flight tasks in these U.S.-made ATACMS operational tactical missiles on the basis of data the U.S. satellite reconnaissance provides. That is why #Washington is mostly responsible for the deliberate missile strike at peaceful residents in Sevastopol by delivering this weaponry to Ukraine, as well as the Kiev regime, from the territory of which the strike was launched. Such actions are not going to be left unanswered. Now, just migrate this back a few years to drone strikes on kids playing soccer in the Middle East, on wedding parties in the Middle East, drone strikes on cell phones that they don't even know are in the hands of suspects, and even those suspects aren't given due process. All of that U.S. behavior under Obama, under Trump, and John Brennan's tutelage all those years, and continuing under Joe Biden all over the world, including U.S. ATACMS missiles that evidently the Russians were able to nail most of these, but in hitting this one, the story is it looks like the pieces landed on the beach. Just unbelievable stuff. That is, it's stunning. Let's turn to a quick headline to give this one to you. Looks like my hard drive might have rejiggered. We will see. We will see on my videos when they start to play. Russia summons the American ambassador over a deadly attack that Moscow says used U.S.-made missiles. That is from the Associated Press. But I want to go beyond the Associated Press and get into further details on this information. So now let's turn to a couple other very important sites. Here we go. Antiwar.com. Kyle Anzalone. Russia warns U.S. retaliatory measures will follow deadly attack in Crimea. In response to a deadly strike on the Crimean Peninsula that killed 4 and wounded over 100, the Russian Foreign Ministry said that Washington had effectively become a party to the war and Moscow would certainly retaliate. And by the way, the request to meet with the Americans delivered by the Russians, they haven't responded. Biden's administration has not responded. On Monday, the Russian Foreign Ministry summoned the U.S. ambassador to express outrage after Sunday's attack in Crimea. The Kremlin claims that American ATACMS missiles were used, that Washington provided intelligence to Kiev to coordinate the attack, and that a U.S. drone was operating near Sevastopol when the assault on civilian targets took place. According to a statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry, the U.S., quote, has effectively become a party to the war on Ukraine's side, adding retaliatory measures will certainly follow. Yes, absolutely right. And of course, let's watch the 7 seconds of video right here of the beach. People are never going to forget those sounds, ever. And they're provided by our tax money because people won't wake up to the fact that the government is illegitimate and they're not fighting back, at least with words. For goodness sake, do something. Good job, Gerald Salenti. Good job, Gerald. So good. I'm glad that he did what he did. Excellent. Getting that information out. Let's go to Scott Ritter and get Scott Ritter's information on this right here. He has about 5 minutes worth that I think is very worthwhile, and it's a very reasoned approach.
Yeah. It's Sunday, and normally this is a day I like to take off and dedicate it to my family, but the events unfolding in Russia, I think, require at least some brief commentary. I'm referring to two events, actually. One, a Ukrainian attack on Sevastopol using U.S.-supplied ATACMS missiles, and the second, a terrorist attack in Dagestan that appears to have all the hallmarks of Western involvement. Let there be no doubt, these are two direct attacks against Russia by proxies of the United States and of NATO. And it's more than just a proxy engagement, given the necessity of preparation, intelligence support, etc. This is a direct attack on Russia by the United States, by NATO, and by non-NATO European entities. All of the parties that have made a decision in the last several days and weeks to expand the scope and scale of their participation in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Now, some people are saying that the Ukrainians deliberately attacked a beach in Sevastopol. The evidence shows that this most likely is not the case, that 5 ATACMS missiles were fired, 4 were shot down. The 5th one being shot down dispersed either cluster bombs or fragments from the destroyed missile onto the beach, killing a number of Russians, wounding many others. But that doesn't matter. The Ukrainians made a decision to use ATACMS missiles equipped with cluster munitions against a city, a civilian city. This is an act of terrorism. This is in keeping with the Ukrainian actions that have transpired over the course of the past years, where Ukraine, since 2014, has been bombarding Russian civilian sites, cities, villages, towns, for the sole purpose of inflicting death and destruction on Russian civilians. This is an act of terrorism. And given that the ATACMS missile cannot be deployed by the Ukrainians without extensive intelligence support by the United States, this is an act of terrorism by the United States against Russia. The same can be said about the attacks in Dagestan. These are deliberately designed to disrupt the civil life of the Russian Federation. Dagestan is part of the Russian Federation. And it's also designed to engender a split between the Muslim and non-Muslim segments of Russian society. This is a tactic that goes back to the first Chechen War and the second Chechen War, where the CIA and other European intelligence agencies sought to split Chechnya away from the Russian Federation. That effort failed, and the effort in Dagestan will fail too. But it doesn't absolve the parties involved of their guilt in launching what is a direct assault on the Russian Federation. Now, the question is, what will Russia do? Historically speaking, the Russian Federation has shown an ability to absorb provocations of this nature and remain focused on the task at hand, which of course is achieving the goals of the special military operation, the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. But at some point in time, there will have to be a response. And what is an appropriate response? That's up for the Russian Federation to decide, but let there be no doubt that if and when the time comes for the Russian Federation to respond to all of those responsible for this horrific series of attacks, that the perpetrators held to account will not just be the Ukrainians, but those who have provided the Ukrainians with the weapons and the intelligence and the training to carry out these dastardly, cowardly attacks. We live in very dangerous times. We live at a time when Russia, the United States, and NATO have all been beating the nuclear drum. We don't need a nuclear war, but that's the direction we're heading if we don't stop this insanity. And by stopping this insanity, this means stopping the United States, stopping NATO, stopping Europe from continuing to facilitate these terrorist attacks by Ukraine against Russia. Have a great Sunday.
Well stated. Good job by Scott Ritter. And I'm noticing that inside Rumble, it looks like we are currently streaming on the Gardner Goldsmith channel, even though it's supposed to be set for the Liberty Conspiracy channel. So I will double check on that, everybody. I've been trying to switch it over, but have been unable to do so. So we'll see what happens. I might have to put the video out later. But if you get the opportunity, please restream this if you can. And also, you know, I'll put this out as during the show. I'll try to switch this over on the Liberty Conspiracy channel. I've been trying, but it's not working right now. So, yeah, that is good information from Scott Ritter. And we're just hoping that Vladimir Putin just continues to take the approach that he has been taking on it. Just give you this, of course, from Bricks News. Russia says, quote, "We know perfectly well who was behind the Ukrainian attack on Crimea, and it was not Ukraine." And there's more video footage coming in from Russia as they try to take care of the people who have been injured, getting them on stretchers and into emergency care. So we'll want to show you some of that quick information for you. And of course, you know, seeing this from afar, just taking it as I can get it. And I'm hoping that the information that I'm seeing is reliable. Of course, everybody has to assess this on his own and see what he or she thinks. But I do think that this information is reliable. So let me quickly show you this. This one coming from Che Bose of Moscow Mules. Here we go. 22 of those injured in the NATO-Ukrainian terror attack in Sevastopol are airlifted to Moscow. Among the number are 12 young children who will be flown to the Russian capital on a special plane provided by the Ministry of Emergency Situations. The American ATACMS missiles that struck the beach killed 4 civilians and left 153 others injured. So he's calling that a terror attack as well. I think that's worthwhile. So there's some footage for you, everybody. I want to give that to you. And a couple other quick ones that I want to mention to you right off the bat. Let's turn now into RT and get some of the coverage from RT about this. But before we do that, let's just remind ourselves a little bit of history here. As I mentioned, lest one forget some of the highlights of U.S. meddling, lies, warmongering, and death dealing. Here's the Nazi pal from Arizona, when he was alive, lying about the regime change in Ukraine. Let's remember John McCain, my friends.
Joining me now, Senator John McCain, who I know, Senator, you have just addressed the crowd of protesters there yourself in Kiev. What is it you're trying to do here?
Hopefully what we're trying to do is bring about a peaceful transition here that would stop the violence, would give the Ukrainian people what they unfortunately have not, with different revolutions that have taken place, a real legitimate society. This is a grassroots revolution here. It's been peaceful except for when the government tried to crack down on them, and the government hasn't done that since. But I'm praising their ability and their desire to demonstrate peacefully for change that I think they deserve.
Let me ask you this about the U.S. role. I know that you have wanted the administration perhaps to consider sanctions, something to help boost the anti-government protesters. Question to you is, while we're trying to work on so many things with the Russians, for instance, with Iran and in Syria, is this really a good time for the U.S. to be taking on Russia?
Well, I don't think that we would be taking on Russia. And by the way, I am very pleased with Secretary Kerry's statement. Our Deputy Secretary Victoria Nuland, who was here. Look, these people love the United States of America. They love freedom. And I don't think you could view this as anything but our traditional support for people who want a free and democratic society. We're not talking about military action. We're not talking about blockades. We are talking about the possibility of sanctions if they continue to brutally repress their people. That would require some action on our part, just because that's what the United States of America is all about.
Okay. Curiously, I thought the United States of America was about the U.S. Constitution, which didn't allow any of that, doesn't allow John McCain to be supporting Ukraine, doesn't allow weapons to be going over to Ukraine. And virtually everything he said there was an absolute lie. The despotism that occurred, the attacks on people that occurred when the United States tried to overthrow the government and successfully did so, starting in late 2013 into 2014. The government that had been elected, Yanukovych's government, and Yanukovych, they had bumped out in 2005. Don't forget, they had bumped out Yanukovych and replaced him with a pro-Western, anti-Russian choice. That, of course, opened up the gates to 2005 and the weapons, biological and chemical weapons plants that started with Barack Obama and Dick Lugar going in there. Then Yanukovych came back in, got reelected in 2013, and they bumped him out. They knocked him out with the Maidan coup, a false flag in front of the Capitol where people were killed. They were shot. It was blamed on the government. It wasn't the government that was involved. Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt were involved in the overthrow of the government and the cobbling together with Nazis with whom John McCain had been visiting at the very time that he was talking to that reporter. John McCain claiming that the United States government wouldn't be involved with some sort of meddling in that country. They already were involved with meddling, and it led exactly where it has come, to the United States being kinetically involved over the past 2 years and now directly attributable to United States involvement with the ATACMS missiles killing innocent Russians. All those people, those lives are on John McCain's hands and many others' hands. His actions that echo from the past, those stories, those canards, all those lies that he told, they redound into the hearts of those people that have been stopped on the beaches of Sevastopol and in other places all around Ukraine and Russia. They have happened because of John McCain and others. The Nazis going into the Donbass region after the government was cobbled together by Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt and others like John Kerry in 2014. Those people who were killed in the ethnically Russian regions, their blood is on his hands and John Kerry and Victoria Nuland's hands. Remember when Nuland said, the Russians, they're going to be in store for some surprises. And then she made sure she focused on in the battlefield. Well, evidently the battlefield includes civilians now, doesn't it? Let's go to Russia Today and some of their coverage. By the way, we are now on the Liberty Conspiracy channel. Thank you, Freegan, everybody in the chat. You guys rock. We're going to continue rocking it forward. Here we go.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that there is no doubt the U.S. bears responsibility for Sunday's terror attack on Crimea. Now, he made those remarks during a press conference with his Belarusian counterpart during a visit to Minsk.
Thank you for your condolences over yesterday's terror attack in Sevastopol. In parallel, there was another terror attack in Dagestan. There were victims. The relative authorities are doing everything to establish those behind them as soon as possible, but the complicity of the United States and their Ukrainian subordinates is not doubted by us. Weapons were used that the US provides to the Ukrainian regime, which cannot be used without direct participation of the US military.
RT's Steve Sweeney is joining me in the studio now for more. I mean, Steve, we've heard from Lavrov strong words in the past. You definitely feel that his patience is being tested, not mincing his words. What was said?
Well, yes, indeed, a very strong statement from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and he said that there is no doubt that the US was behind Sunday's terror attack on Crimea. Now, he said that this wasn't just about the weapons, that he said that this was, he underlined the fact that the kind of missile that was used, this was an ATACMS US long-range missile. These missiles cannot be used without the direct participation of the United States military. Now, of course, we've all seen the horrific scenes. 4 people were killed, 2 of them children, as the missiles were launched at a packed beach in Sevastopol. Of course, Sunday was a very important day in the Russian Orthodox calendar. It was the Holy Trinity celebrations, but instead of celebrations, there's now 3 days of mourning, and a community remains very much in shock. Now, Russia summoned the US ambassador and said that such an attack will not be left without retaliation.
The US, which is waging a hybrid war against Russia and has in fact become a party of the conflict by supplying the Ukrainian armed forces with the most modern weaponry, bears equal responsibility with the Kiev regime for this atrocity. The ambassador was informed that such actions by Washington, which are intended to encourage the pro-Nazi authorities in Ukraine to continue fighting until the last Ukrainian, by authorizing strikes deep into Russian territory, will not go unpunished. Retaliatory measures will certainly follow.
Well, very strong words again there. Now, the Pentagon has responded, and it said that it is up to Ukraine to decide the targets it chooses to hit. But, of course, we heard earlier from Lavrov, who said, again, that the missile that was used in the attack on Sevastopol can only be used with the direct involvement of the United States military. Now, an aide to Zelensky has gone even further, and he said that there are only civilian occupiers in Crimea, and he justified that attack.
There are none and cannot be any beaches, tourist zones, or other fictitious signs of peaceful life in Crimea. Crimea is certainly a foreign territory occupied by Russia, where fighting is taking place and a full-scale war is continuing.
Stopping right there, does that remind you of some of the language that you hear from some of the IDF forces talking about innocent children inside Gaza? That, of course, they're just going to grow up to become Hamas fighters, so there are no civilians inside Gaza. Does that remind you of that sort of bloodthirsty language? Because it does to me.
War that Russia unleashed solely for a genocidal and aggressive purpose. Crimea is also a large military camp and warehouse with hundreds of direct military targets, which the Russians are cynically trying to mask and cover with their own civilians who, for their own part, are civilian occupiers.
Now, of course, attacks such as we saw in Crimea on Sunday targeting civilians constitute war crimes, but the West seems happy to turn a blind eye when it comes to Ukraine. Of course, admitting so would also make them complicit. Now, this was a wide-ranging press conference. Lavrov also condemned the escalations by the West in the Middle East and said that Russia was doing all it can to prevent a spillover. He was, of course, referring to Israel, which seems to be preparing the ground for a ground operation, an attack on neighboring Lebanon. Israel, of course, again, heavily backed by the West. But coming back to the Ukraine conflict and the special military operation, he said that all of the actions carried out by the West were in fact ultimatums to Russia, including the scuppering of peace deals. Now, we've just had the peace conference, or the so-called peace conference, hosted by Ukraine in Switzerland, which actually turned out to be a failure, really. It failed to secure any sense of unity. 15 countries refused to sign that final declaration. Of course, the elephant in the room was the absence absence of Russia. This was largely seen as an attempt at shoring up waning support for the conflict in Ukraine amongst its Western backers. The Global South largely rejected it, refused to sign up or refused to attend. There's a second peace conference supposedly in the offing, but again, Russia won't be invited to attend that. So Lavrov did touch upon the peace proposals that had been offered by Russia going back as far as 2014. Of course, the Minsk Accords, which were supposed to bring a peaceful settlement to the situation in Donbass. And we know what happened to the Minsk Accords. Of course, this was guaranteed by France and Germany. And we know what happened there, thanks to Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, the respective presidents and chancellor of those countries, that there wasn't really any chance of that succeeding, that it was really aimed at buying time for Ukraine to arm itself. And he mentioned the peace proposal outlined by Vladimir Putin on June the 14th, ahead of the Swiss peace conference, which was again rejected by the West. And of course, while these kind of, these peace conferences are ongoing, or these peace negotiations are failing, we're seeing an uptick in these kind of attacks. Of course, it was the British Foreign Secretary, the unelected peer, Lord David Cameron, who really got the ball rolling in this direction. It was him that first said that these long-range missiles can be used to attack Russian territory. Other countries in Europe soon followed suit. The US again then said that it was okay as long as they were military targets. Some were a little bit more reticent about the use of the missiles that they've supplied. But time and time again, we're seeing these longer range missiles now striking civilian buildings. And of course, we saw the horror attack on Sunday.
So there's a lot more here, everybody. I just want to mention a couple things, three things very quickly to inject here, and then we're going to continue with some of this footage. First, don't forget that it looks like Mark Rutte, the former head of Holland, the guy who wanted to starve out the agricultural sector, make sure they couldn't use nitrogen fertilizer, get rid of cattle and that sort of thing, buy up or grab tons and tons of land to create the 15-minute cities and stuff, totally in with the WEF agenda. He is going to be the next NATO head. Yeah, Mark Rutte, the guy who engaged in warfare against the people in his own country. He's the trustworthy guy to put in charge of friggin' NATO. That's the guy. That's going to be just great. Jan Stoltenberg wasn't bad enough, right? In addition to that, you've got the leader of Hungary, Viktor Orban, who is saying, we don't want to have anything to do with the EU's plan. Get this. This is the side spinner to the U.S. spin on taking the Russian assets that they've frozen and supplying some form of money with those Russian assets. The U.S. government has frozen some, but the EU has frozen a bunch as well. So right now, there's a question as to whether or not the United States and the EU are going to be simulcasting their use of stolen Russian money to be able to supply either weapons or money to the Ukrainians. We'll get to some of that information coming up, but I wanted to put that in there right now because these are some of the things that are spinning out of control. It's getting really, really crazy. And this reckless rhetoric from people like Newland and David Cameron and people like other folks in the Democrat Party who are sitting there saying, we've got to do more. You look at what Lindsey Graham does and the Republican Party. Just absolutely insane, maniacal stuff driven by their connections and their personal greed. And of course, decades of the United States involvement with so-called anti-Soviet forces that were tied to Nazi forces. And we showed that video, a number of those videos in chunks from RT, the documentary about the United States anti-communist forces after World War II, connecting with Nazis, pulling Nazis in from Germany, using the very strong anti-Soviet, pro-Norse and pro-pagan traditions of some of the folks that they had there in the Ukrainian area to try to get them to fight the Russians. The 2005 departure, the push out of Yanukovych when he was first elected, all those things, the bringing in of the bioweapons. We're going to watch some documentary footage on that connects to another country where the U.S. was doing it at the same time. And believe me, when you hear part of this video that I've recorded for you, it will definitely sound alarm bells for you if you know the two main people who were involved in getting those bioweapons labs started in 2005, 2006 in Ukraine. Let's continue right now with some of this RT coverage on this unbelievable situation.
That we're seeing, these kind of attacks, are really moving further and further away from peace, and more people are being killed.
Indeed, a very bloody Sunday here in Russia, and a very worrying, like you said, trend towards escalation. That was RT's Steve Sweeney joining me in the studio. Thank you, Steve. Well, the Russian State Duma chair claims that the terror cases in Crimea and Dagestan may be linked.
These are inhumane crimes. Each of them is under investigation. It is possible that in both cases, the organizers will turn out to be the same.
Similar to what we heard Scott Ritter mention.
Well, for more on this, let's cross to international affairs and security analyst Mark Sloboda. Mark, always great to have you on the program. I mean, as Steve was just talking us through, there we have Lavrov saying there's absolutely no doubt the US was involved. Then we have Kiev, or rather Washington, saying Kiev chooses the targets for themselves. Two competing narratives. In your mind, which one of them wins out?
Well, those really aren't two competing narratives. According to the U.S. officials, the Kiev regime that they back chooses the targets. They're simply unable to hit those targets without active U.S. assistance. These are U.S. missiles. They are fired and receive their targeting information from U.S. satellites and U.S. reconnaissance planes and drones that are 24/7 flying south of Crimea and the Black Sea, and U.S. military experts are inputting the data for that targeting information into the missiles in order for them to allow them to be fired. As we know from the statements from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, from German generals plotting to blow up the Crimean Bridge with Taurus cruise missiles, and even the Polish president have all admitted that it is Western military experts firing, actually inputting the data for the firing of these Western advanced military systems. I mean, there might be a Kiev regime military person in the area somewhere as a sock puppet, as a fig leaf, a implausible degree of deniability, but there really is no doubt, and the Russian government doesn't hesitate to call it out. This was a U.S. attack on Russian Crimea.
I mean, I do want to ask you, because obviously when the US greenlit Kiev striking into Russian territory with its weapons, do you think it considered a scenario that happened this Sunday? Do you think it was a human cost that it was willing to pay? Or do you think, in fact, it was almost hoping that an incident like that would happen as a provocation of some kind?
For months now, well over 6 months, Western weapons, checkmate Vampire multiple launch rocket systems, have been used by the Kiev regime to shell residential areas of Belgorod in, if you want to call it, pre-2014 Russia. The West was fully cognizant of this information. And the New York Times even spoke of it in approving terms, saying the war needed to be brought home to the Russian people. Sometimes, as in this particular case, the Crimean people, civilians, were simply unfortunate tragedy because there's no information that they deliberately targeted the beach. Their cluster munition went off target after being intercepted with an air defense missile. But they simply don't care. In other instances, civilian deaths have been the actual intention of the Kiev regime, obviously with complete Western complicity and approval.
And finally, I do just want to ask you, picking up on what we heard Mikhail Podolyak say, he's obviously Vladimir Zelensky's advisor, all of Crimea is a war zone, and all the people who live there are civilian occupiers. I mean, what do you make of rhetoric like that? I mean, surely it's not going to ingratiate the government in Kiev to the people that it thinks that it should be ruling, the Crimeans.
Yeah, full disclosure, my wife is Crimean. I have in-laws in Crimea, and I've spent a couple months of every year for the last 21 years in Crimea. So I'm well familiar with the people there. This sociopathic, Gobel-esque mouthpiece for the Kiev regime, Mikhail Podolyak, he has previously said that there are none, and there can be no Russian speakers or Russian ethnic people in Ukraine. Whereas before the conflict began in 2014, 20% of Ukraine was, all world source information agrees, roughly 20% of the population, and over half the population of Ukraine spoke Russian at home on a daily basis. When demographic and linguistic and other realities don't match up with the genocidal, ultranationalist, Banderite ideology of this regime and its officials, reality is simply denied. And what he is accusing is that the long-standing population of Crimea, my family there included, are all not real Ukrainians. They are occupiers because they refused to accept the overthrow of the government that they had elected to their presidency in Ukraine in 2014, and afterwards held a referendum whose results have been upheld by polling by Pew and Gallup and GFK and everyone else, that over 95% of the population, well over in Crimea, wants nothing to do with that regime and the people behind it, including Gobel-esque genocidal maniacs like Mikhail Podolyak.
The facts are brilliant. They are blindingly clear, and they are everywhere. And we're seeing people chatting, that woman working for Russia Today, that guy and his family. Literally, we have people in the chat and we're zipping back and forth, communicating with each other, and great communications from people as they talk about the fact that these people claim there are no innocent civilians inside the chat. I'm seeing comments like that. Excellent, excellent points. Yes, it's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. The sheer differential between the reality that we recognize, that man recognizes with his family, those beachgoers recognize, the real world of life and meeting someone to love, raising a family, and these vampires out there. And what they are doing is growing increasingly stark, increasingly noticeable, and increasingly disturbing. And it's something that I just wonder what is going to happen, because it looks like the Bidenistas are not willing to stop. And that includes the Lindsey Grahams and the Rhino GOPs of this world, many of the GOP, because they're so closely tied to the so-called defense industry, which is the demon industry, demonocracy. They're so fond of calling it democracy. It's demonocracy. They run things. It's a feedback loop, and you are along for the ride as slave labor. This is just unbelievable. And I want to continue with other items. I want to thank Brian and Deb McCartney for being in there inside Rokfin. And also JB, thanks for being there, JB. This is a very intense day. We've got a lot more to cover. Jeb Stewart, thanks for being there. Absolutely. Thank you so much for being there. And Risha M, thanks for being there. Awesome. Really appreciate it. And Risha M says, I was on Rokfin, didn't get the notification from Rumble. Sorry, Risha. Yeah, we were on the wrong channel there for a couple minutes. And it's just, one of those minor frustrations that you experience as the team and I put everything together. But there is more to discuss here. And I want to now turn to the Twitter feed so that you can find even more information on my Twitter feed. Inside Twitter, you'll see some other information that I've offered that hopefully will be worthwhile for you. Let me head over to my profile and show you some of this stuff. Now, you'll find that I've retweeted most of the information and, re-X'd it, that sort of thing. But in addition to the information that we're seeing coming out of Russia Today, I want to mention, in addition to that, that you'll see some very good links from Aaron Monte and Katie Halper doing excellent work today covering some major stories. But in addition to that, I want to turn to this from our friend Eric Peters, who puts something very, very well here. This is his latest one, War Yet? And he writes this with some historical memories. The news says that America just cluster bombed Russian beachgoers in Crimea. Well, it didn't say exactly that, but nonetheless, that is exactly what just happened. The Kievians may have pushed the proverbial button that sent the missiles on their way, but it was America, more finely, the regime that rules Americans, that provided the missiles and apparently the support needed to guide them to their target. It is nothing less than astounding that Russia has not attacked back yet, but of a certainty, it's coming, because that is what happens when a country is attacked. It hits back in self-defense at the country that attacked it. That country is not Kyiv, just as, for those who still remember such things, it would not have been Cuba that attacked the United States back in 1962, the last time the world came this close to nuclear war. The missiles in Cuba were Russian, and JFK publicly stated that any missile fired from Cuba would be regarded as an attack by Russia, then the Soviet Union, upon the United States, and the United States would respond accordingly. Everyone, including the leadership of the Soviet Union, understood exactly what that would entail. If the Cubans fired a Soviet-provided missile at the United States would return fire with nuclear missiles. We were this close, and now we are again. The harrowing difference this time is that psychopaths are in charge of the United States. JFK was a womanizer, and what a difference that makes. He had no desire to see either the Soviet Union or the United States immolated in a nuclear holocaust over Cuba, and neither did the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. He was many things also, but thankfully not a psychopath. The two men were able to reason together and arrive at a solution to end what would come to be called the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a lot more that he has to say there. He talks about Vladimir Putin's restraint and more. But I want to just remind you, that video that we showed a little bit earlier of John McCain, let's just remind you, that very day, John McCain was on stage with that man. The very day that John McCain was talking about the wonderful so-called democratic revolution that the United States, and he knew the United States had engaged in, the overthrow of that government in late 2013 and the installation of the new government, he was on stage that very day. He even mentioned that they had just had the gathering. That was the day that this picture was taken. Let me enlarge it for you so you can see a little better. And if you're listening on freeworld.fm, on the left is a picture of John McCain on stage. And just to his left, to our right, is a man named Ole Tjanibak. Ole Tjanibak is also in the right picture, doing the Nazi salute, with the lightning bolts behind him, with the Nazi iconography behind him, because he is a Nazi. He was the head of the Sloboda Party, with whom the people like Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt negotiated to put Yatsenyuk in charge in 2014, and then see Hunter Biden put on the board of Burisma to stop dealing with the Russians with their energy exports, and of course shave money off for the big guy. That's where John McCain had been the very day that he offered all that slippery, evil wording to that reporter from CNN, so-called reporter. He was on stage with a known Nazi who's also in photographs meeting with Joe Biden, who was then vice president. I just figured I'd let you know about that in case you wondered where John McCain had been that day. And don't forget this one. I sometimes show this in tandem. This is John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Amy Klobuchar, and others from the United States hanging out with members of the Azov Battalion. That's awesome. Very well aware, because they had decades of coverage with the Nazis as they went through the Soviet Cold War under people like Gene Kirkpatrick, and we saw the video of them overthrowing Yanukovych the first time in 2005, and then, of course, doing it again in 2013. There's a lot more. Now, I want to now turn to more coverage from RT and give you this. Check this out.
Russian Orthodox churches, synagogues, so they're trying to provoke inter-religion conflict.
This is the so-called terrorist attack, which of course probably had nothing at all to do with U.S. intelligence and Ukrainian intelligence. And don't forget that Joe Biden never, ever, ever said to the 101st Airborne Division 2 years ago when he visited the newly created Polish camp of Kosciuszko, and he met with the 101st Airborne as a surprise. He didn't at all. Don't remember this in any way whatsoever. He never said that some of you guys have already been in Ukraine, doing special ops there. Quiet. Don't even discuss that. Let's continue with the terrorist attack that, yes, seems to have been done to try to gin up an anger against Islamic people. And of course, that, will be tied to the Palestinians.
National conflict inside Russian Federation.
Israel has faced a barrage.
We're going to get to the Israel human shield thing in just a minute. Now I want to give you one other quick item. And in fact, what I'm going to do is later in the program, please bookmark this for the end of the show. I'm going to tie in for you the 2005 replacement of Yanukovych and the bioweapons that we know, the bioweapons labs that we know were started with Barack Obama, then Senator, and Senator Dick Lugar visiting, bringing billions of dollars there, opening up at least 5 biological chemical weapons plants, to video footage that I'm going to show you at the end of the program about something that was happening in Georgia at the same time. And I don't mean the state of Georgia. To round off this information from Russia, let's turn back to antiwar.com and give you this. Don't forget, Connor Freeman on June 20th, U.S. Ukraine can strike anywhere Russian forces may cross the border. Just remember that one. And there's a lot more. Now, let's get your thoughts, and then we're going to turn to the Middle East. And thanks for hanging out, everybody, especially inside Rumble, as we see the numbers ratcheting up in the audience for Rokfin and for Rumble. And I greatly appreciate everybody being there. It is very cool. Please share, especially since we were on the Gardner Goldsmith channel, and that was for the first 15 minutes of the show on Rumble. If you're watching on X, thank you also, and feel free, put your comments inside there. Let's head over to Rokfin and see what people are saying inside Rokfin as we now will switch over into some of that Israeli insanity. And I appreciate everybody hanging out inside Rokfin, our very first home. And it's just awesome to see everyone there. If you're listening on freeworld.fm, thank you. And remember, you can watch these videos after the fact on Rumble and on Rokfin. And on Rumble and on YouTube. And on Rumble, you can look for us now under the Liberty Conspiracy handle tonight because it is on the right channel. So inside Rumble, we've got Freegan talking about McCain. Yeah, the McCain cream pies had graham wafer crumb crust. Freegan, you know how to connect the dots, buddy. You know how to connect the dots. Yes, indeed. All right. Let's get over into some of that Israeli information. And again, if you want to find that piece from Eric Peters, that's on my Twitter/X feed. That is from his Libertarian Car Talk, ericpeters.com, ericpetersautos.com. Now let's get into some of the Israeli information. Going to turn back to antiwar.com and give you this one. This one is sort of the overall umbrella to start us getting deeper into the details of some of the terrible things that the Israelis have been doing over the weekend. Wonderful, wonderful summertime for everyone there. And I don't mean to make light of this unbelievable war crime atrocity situation that the United States is feeding. I'm being very sarcastic. Netanyahu rejects any deal that leads to permanent end to the war on Gaza? Well, of course, because he's already shown maps of what he thinks the area will look like in the future, and it will be all Israel. Kyle Anzalone put this out today, filling in for Dave DeCamp, adding to Kyle's excellent work from Libertarian Institute. And, of course, he put out his Monday show on YouTube as well. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he will only agree to a partial deal with Hamas that allows him to restart the assault after a pause to exchange hostages. The remarks show that Netanyahu is unwilling to sign on to an agreement proposed by President Joe Biden. Well, let's talk about Israeli hostages, because nobody seems willing to apply the logic that we've applied here and other people have applied to question the semantics of, well, Israel is trying to rescue the hostages. And so therefore, under the Hannibal Directive, it can kill the hostages and it can wipe out civilians inside Gaza, inside the occupied zone that it has been occupying since Israel was created in the 1940s. Yeah, Israel has every excuse. And then, of course, if you complain, you're anti-Semitic and somehow must be a holdover of the Nazis, even though the United States works with Nazis in Ukraine. You can figure that one out. But while we're at it, let's just think about the Israeli argument that they're going to rescue hostages. Because as I've mentioned, hundreds of people every year are held by the Israelis without trial, without due process, and they're tortured. The ICC has already cited Netanyahu for that, for war crimes. Now let's go back to that coverage from RT about the latest unbelievable stuff. In addition to attacking people inside the West Bank and Lebanon with, we'll talk about it in a minute, with a white phosphorus, we've got this unbelievable story that just puts it all in your face.
Israel has faced a barrage of criticism after video emerged of its soldiers strapping an injured Palestinian man to the front of a military jeep. It happened during a raid on the West Bank city of Jenin. A warning, disturbing images are ahead. So in this footage, you can see an Israeli vehicle driving through the streets with the man on the front. The IDF said its troops came under fire and the suspect was wounded. However, it admitted that the soldiers had violated military protocol and said the incident would be investigated. The UN Special Rapporteur called it a human shield in action. Meanwhile, in Gaza, a Palestinian detainee has been released from an Israeli prison suffering from severe mental health problems. In an interview to RT, his father claimed his son had always had issues, but the torture that he had endured behind bars had greatly exacerbated his condition.
Badr suffered with his mental health, but the psychological illness wasn't the main issue. The shock and torture made his condition worse. This imprisonment of his was no small matter. Look at how his legs, arms and neck have been tortured. All of this will affect him in the future. And now he needs treatment as well, because now you have to start from scratch to treat him since he was better than this before. From his head to his hands and legs are all mutilated. Now, even yesterday when he saw dogs, he started running and sat on the ground because he has developed a severe fear and anxiety. Now he has more disorders than before. He wasn't like this. Badir, when he saw a dog at night, he would walk normally, not run away. Now he runs away, and all of this intensified because of the detention and torture.
Badr Dahlan, a 29-year-old Palestinian, is just one of many Gazans who have been detained by Israeli forces since October 7th. Now, he was arrested in the south of the Palestinian enclave in Khan Yunis area and spent a month behind bars. His father said that for weeks he did not know about his son's detention.
We didn't know he was detained. We informed the Red Cross, the hospitals, and we searched for him on the streets. I asked all the kids to spread out. Some went to Deir, others went to the Al-Aqsa Hospital, others to Nasir Hospital. We wanted to find out if he was dead or alive because we'd lost him for 20 days.
This is the story that has been perennial for years, I should say, inside Gaza. So the question pops up again. If Hamas had used the same argument that the Israelis use, that, well, you're holding hostages, you're not charging them with anything, we're going to attack you and come over the border. We, the people who are supposedly representative of the people inside the occupied territories, you know, the Hamas leadership that has been getting money thanks to Benjamin Netanyahu's okay and his push to do it, and the United States doing the same. We're going to attack Israel and kill Israeli civilians and Israeli military in order to rescue the hostages that the Israelis are holding. What would the Israelis say? Right? Just incredible. This is the sort of thing. They just pluck people off the streets. Over and over and over again, you see reporters talking about this. People who go in and they come out saying, what the heck am I seeing? This is nuts.
We finally said after 20 days, okay, he might be dead. We lost hope. Honestly, if the soldier had thought he had psychological issues, he wouldn't have done this to him. They wouldn't have mutilated his hands and legs and caused such injuries. If they had known, they would have released him earlier.
Well, let's take a closer look at the treatment of Palestinians in Israeli jails and detention centers. So, according to multiple reports and testimonies from former prisoners, Palestinians are subjected to torture and beatings. Israeli forces restrict their food and water and often blindfold them. And at least 40 Palestinians have reportedly died in Israeli military detention centers, with another 16 in prison in just the past 8 months. Well, since the beginning of the war in Gaza, the number of arrests of Palestinians by Israeli forces has dramatically increased. According to the Palestinian Prisoners Society, more than 9,000 Palestinians from the West Bank are in Israeli prisons, some of them women and children. Now, 1/3 of the total number of prisoners are held under administrative detention without trial.
So let's just keep that in mind. That's 3,100 people held without trial. 3,100, 1/3 of that 9,300 without trial. And they recycle this. Sometimes they'll drop people back into Gaza and pick up new people and just repeat the cycle. And nobody knows who's going to be picked up.
These prisoners can be held for 6 months without charge, and the period can be extended. Human rights activist Jenna Abu Hasna said that Israel uses prison torture as collective punishment of Palestinians.
From what we have been documenting since after October 7th, that a lot of instances and a lot of acts of torture are being implemented and practiced against Palestinian prisoners since the start of October 7th as a form of collective punishment against Palestinian detainees. So it is very likely that this man, as he mentioned as well himself, was subjected to many different various forms of torture. Starvation policies as well are being practiced against the Palestinian prisoners. Detainees are being subjected to multiple beatings several times in a day. A lot of the hits are aimed at the head in order for the occupation to ensure the most immense amount of damage and injuries to prisoners. And they undergo psychological torture as well, not just physical torture, but as well as psychological torture in the sense that they place prisoners in isolation for prolonged periods of time. They will use the detainees' family members against them, meaning that they will threaten their family members as well. So they do really subject Palestinian detainees to many different forms of physical and mental torture as well. So the human brain can only take so much.
Yeah, very good coverage. Again, RT, so glad that I signed up to RT. And also, I just want to mention to everybody, I appreciate you being here so much. And it's so great to have you here. You know, this is really intense, brutal information about things that are happening beyond our reach, beyond our hearing. Somewhere out there in the air, it's reverberating with the bombs that are destroying lives. And we're not necessarily hearing it, but we're communicating with each other about these things, and we're seeing it on video. And hopefully the information we're getting is pretty well vetted, and hopefully it's pretty reliable. Whether it's the information from Ukraine and Sevastopol and the Crimean region, the information coming from the Middle East and so on and so forth, and a lot more than that. And I want to mention to you, as my appreciation towards you, this week I'm going to do 2 giveaways here on the show. So we'll do something fun, maybe a trivia question or something like that, and we'll open it up to people, and then inside Rokfin or Rumble chat or something like that, the first person who gets it, if you want to participate, the only thing you have to be willing to do is contact me on the backside of Twitter/X and, give me your mailing address, and I'll send you this something or other. I got a couple things, got a DVD and I have a book. So maybe do some fun stuff like that, because I appreciate you being here so much. And it's so great because, thanks to you, not only do I get the extra oomph, the extra energy to do this put this information out and expand on the work I do for MRC TV and try to apply myself to these stories, whether it's constitutional stuff or historical or economic or ethical, that sort of stuff. But I get information from you about news stories, and I just feel such a positive vibe. You are all out there helping to expand and spread the word about the show, and it's so cool. So we'll do that. It's going to be awesome, and we'll have a lot of fun with many, many smiles, even though it's tough. It's good to be able to fight for principle. That's for darn sure, and I sure do appreciate it, everybody. So we're going to discuss even more information coming up. I just want to mention even more stories coming up, but inside the war stuff, I want to get back into a couple of the things that we do want to mention here that cover Israel. Because, yes, Israel is attacking more than Gaza. In fact, if you go to my Twitter/X feed, let me just bring this over to you. You'll see that they recently launched what appears to be white phosphorus over the West Bank. And in addition to that, they killed food aid workers in Gaza. Again, more food aid workers in Gaza attacked. So let's go into some of the information about the white phosphorus. Just want to show you some of the video here, and also get your opinions about some of these things and ask you how many times some of the public so-called representatives in Congress can appear in front of people and hear from people before they get the message. I think they've gotten the message and they don't care. They know where their bread is buttered, and they're going to get reelected. Here's Che Bose, of course, again, from Moscow Mules. Israel is attacking Lebanon with incendiary and phosphorus munitions. There are local rumors that this is a preparation for a ground assault by Israeli troops into Lebanon. There you go. Let me blow this up a little bigger for you. So, looks like fireworks to me, but there are more reports on that, and it is confirmed. So, now what do? We're going to be seeing more kinetic attacks inside the West Bank, possibly an attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon, and a wider expansion using U.S. military, which is going to drain the Israelis, and they're not going to like what happens after that. The United States has been involved so much, whether it's with Ukraine, whether it's with Israel, and the occupation there for decades, whether it is, of course, the occupation of your life, the destruction of your earnings, so many terrible things that they do, and a direct, perfect example of what the United States government has been doing is what they've been doing to Julian Assange. So 2 things to mention about Julian Assange as we shift out of the Israeli information and go into some other stories in our news flash. This is a story from WikiLeaks, things that just disappear. Files disappear from the phone of the former Spanish soldier who spied on Julian Assange for the CIA. The police did not hand over David Morales' WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, Proton Mail, and Skype conversations to the judge. The magistrate has ordered their immediate recovery. And yes, here's one from 2017. UK prosecutors admit destroying key emails in Julian Assange case. Here's one from 2013. Julian Assange claims his encrypted laptops were stolen in 2010 while traveling. It's interesting how the government can do all those things and get away with it, while Julian Assange releases real information about war crimes and they want to prosecute him. Well, Stella Assange put this out 20 hours ago. Bookmark this. This is how they're going to present their appeal coming up in the next few weeks, coming up in the beginning of July. This is Assange's appeal to request that he be not extradited to the United States. They're going to deliver it to the High Court of Justice in London, and this is their introduction. She says, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks were responsible for the exposure of criminality on the part of the U.S. government on a massive and unprecedented scale. The publication in 2010 and 2011 of materials sent by a serving military officer, Private Manning, sit at the very apex of public interest disclosures. By publishing this material, WikiLeaks exposed outrageous, even murderous wrongdoing, war crimes, torture, and atrocities on civilians. That from Feldstein. Their second piece of the introduction, Julian Assange's work dedicated to ensuring public accountability by exposing global human rights abuses and facilitating the investigation of and prosecution for state criminality has contributed to the saving of countless lives, stopped human rights abuses in their tracks, and brought down despotic and autocratic regimes. They also say, those who expose grave state criminality, defenders of fundamental human rights, are and always have been vulnerable to acts of political retaliation and persecution from the regimes whose criminality they expose. Julian Assange is no exception. And they bring up this. The law is fiercely protective of human rights defenders. Exposure of state criminality is, in law, a protected political act, the product of a political opinion. Prosecutions on account of such acts are straightforwardly prohibited. This is under British law. The history of this prosecution between Mr. Assange's exposures in 2010 and 2011 and the indictment in 2018 is a textbook example of political persecution. The course of this case since 2011 is simply extraordinary. And they have a lot more. So I suggest you can follow Stella Assange's X address is Stella, STELLA _Assange. So please follow her and the good work she does. And of course, her whole team is just remarkable, just excellent, excellent stuff. So let's get into a couple other things, everybody, and give you a little different course for things. It's time for us to get into some of the quick, lighter stories. And for that, of course, we're turning to the mothership, the News Flash.
Yes? Oh, hello. Hello. We're Mary's parents. Oh, well, come on in, fellas. Hold it a second. Mary's parents burned to death last year. Wait a minute. I know you guys. You're from the News Flash.
Yeah, you tell them, Queen. You tell them. All right, everybody. First up in our News Flash, let's get right to it. Let's get into the Supreme Court and the Rahimi decision. This is the other big story in a way. And in fact, we could have devoted the entire show to this one. The Rahimi case. We need a theme, my friends. Let's turn to our black and white pal, Perry. Yes, Perry. So are you curious to get into some of the details on this Rahimi case and see what we can learn from this and take away so that we can have some long-standing lessons about liberty, in particular, the right to keep and bear arms? I am. Yes, everybody. Yes. All right. Let's go with it right now. Let's check out the story because I've got it covered, I hope, pretty well for MRC TV, and we got a pretty good video. And thank you so much to the editors in Washington. Wrote the big story, This is the other big story, Joe Piscopo, from the Supreme Court ruling that came out late Friday. Wasn't able to cover it Friday afternoon. Wasn't even aware of it until after I finished the show on Friday night. And so I've been watching this for a while. I've been writing little bits and pieces about what was coming in the Rahimi case on the Supreme Court docket from last fall, talking about the very questionable idea that if the government thinks that someone is safe enough to put out into the public because they're not a felon or anything like that, then why are they saying that they're not safe enough to have a gun? There seems to be a problem with a so-called justice system to keep you safe that has that contrast in its thinking. But in addition to that, there is the Bill of Rights at stake here. And there are a number of positions that are completely counter to the Bill of Rights that have been brought up in this 8-1 decision. 8-1. There was only one dissent from Clarence Thomas, everybody. This is massive. This is a big, big deal. And it really shows us something bad about what that could be on the docket for a lot of different policies around the nation. We're talking red flag implications. Check this out, my friends. Here we go.
In a word salad-filled, fantastical ruling, the majority of justices in the Supreme Court, June 21st, determined that it's perfectly consistent with their make-believe view of the Constitution for any level of government to prohibit a free individual from possessing a gun, despite that person not being in jail, not having had due process, and despite that person possessing a natural right to carry and use a firearm, a right that supposedly is explicitly protected by the Second Amendment. Hi, everyone. I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC TV, and here's the story. Amy Howe reports for SCOTUS blog. Quote, the Supreme Court on Friday upheld a federal law that bars anyone subject to a domestic violence restraining order from possessing a gun. By a vote of 8-1, the court ruled that the law does not violate the Constitution's Second Amendment, which protects the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Nice of her to only use that portion of it. The ruling in the United States v. Rahimi was the court's first Second Amendment case since it threw out New York's handgun licensing scheme nearly 2 years ago. In that case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, the majority emphasized that courts should uphold gun restrictions only when there is a tradition of such regulation in U.S. history. Here are background details of the case, but I want to note that this specific case is being utilized to facilitate the Supreme Court majority's abstract misreading of the Bill of Rights. And as inflammatory as the details of this particular case might appear, the man in question was not convicted of a crime, nor was he ever given due process prior to the restraining order placed on him that lies as the proverbial trigger for the gun ban. Writes Howe, quote, the challenge to the law came from a Texas man, Zaki Rahimi. In 2020, a court in Texas entered a civil protective order against him after Rahimi dragged his then girlfriend back to his car when she tried to leave after an argument. He pushed her into the car, causing her to hit her head on the dashboard. Rahimi also fired a gun at a bystander who witnessed the incident. The protective order specifically barred Rahimi from having a gun, like so-called red flag laws, to which the new court ruling clearly offers a knowing nod or wink of permissibility. In the case of the Rahimi order, the government breached nearly half of the Bill of Rights. Texas didn't give him due process, which is required by the Fifth Amendment. Texas did not give him a speedy and public trial before an impartial jury with a chance to call witnesses, as is required by the 6th Amendment. Texas followed the toweringly anti-constitutional provisions of the November 1988 federal add-on to the 1968 Gun Control Act, known as the so-called Undetectable Firearms Act, which contained in it what is called U.S. Code Title 18, subsection 922G8, claiming the power to seize Rahimi's gun or punish him for having one, which is both property seizure without just compensation, prohibited by the 5th Amendment, and is cruel and unusual punishment, prohibited by the 8th Amendment. He was given no trial because this act of criminal malfeasance by the government of Texas, under the auspices of the aforementioned subsection 922G8 code, passed in 1988, was conducted under the guise of so-called civil procedure. It's been a handy way for governments on every level of the United States to skirt the Bill of Rights and engage in things like civil asset forfeiture, to take the property of drug users or dealers and keep it, rather than involve the actual rights that are supposed to be afforded under normal criminal proceedings, as the founders envisioned everything. Pretty nifty, isn't it? And get this, in backing up their absurd avoidance of the Bill of Rights, the majority on the bench this time did two more insulting things. First, they utilized what I've been trying to warn people was coming ever since former Justice Antonin Scalia dealt away the very notion of rights with his majority opinion in the 2008 DC v. Heller case. At the end of the decision, Scalia added the phrase, "rights are not unlimited," which completely undercuts the very meaning of rights. Rights are supposed to be untouchable by government. That's the point. We can freely adjust how much we want to exercise our rights among other voluntary associative people. But the state, that involuntary agency of force, cannot breach our rights. Scalia's one line in Heller destroyed the very meaning of the term, claiming an opening for political forces and future courts to invade our rights. And on page 2 of this new ruling, in just the syllabus of this ruling, and throughout his majority opinion, Chief Justice Roberts referred to Heller, indicating that, well, heck, Antonin Scalia said we can attack rights. So yeah, it's totally cool to overlook the concept and also the strict wording of the Second Amendment, which concludes with shall not be infringed. Yeah, I know, it's really surprising, isn't it? Also not surprising was the fact that the majority both utilized the so-called two-tier standard of the 2022 SCOTUS decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. What the court did then was they created a two-tier analysis of statutes to see whether or not they infringe on the right to keep and bear arms as protected by the Second Amendment. It should be fairly simple. But they created two tiers of analysis. The first tier is whether or not the statute actually conforms with the wording of the Second Amendment, which is essentially a question of asking, does this statute adhere to the wording by infringing or not infringing on the right to keep and bear arms? If it infringes, well, then it doesn't adhere. It's pretty simple. But then the Supreme Court added a second level of analysis. And that second level is, well, if you can supply us with a historical example of someone grabbing a gun that was at the time maybe accepted by people close to the constitutional era, well, then we'll accept that if it's analogous to the contemporary gun grab. It's absurd because it undercuts the first stage of the Bruin analysis. Roberts, Kavanaugh, Brown Jackson, Barrett, Sotomayor, Kagan, Alito, and Gorsuch all agreed to various levels that such an absurd bipolar position on the right to keep and bear arms is perfectly fine. And that such an overtly obvious attack on the other amendments noted earlier in this video also is acceptable. In Amy Howe's report and in the Roberts text, we also discovered that Roberts included not just references to British bans on firearms in the 17th and 18th centuries as excuses for contemporary gun grabs like this, but also that Roberts claimed that at the time of the adoption of the Bill of Rights, the musket was the most powerful privately owned weapon. Well, as I've noted for MRC TV, and someone might want to mention to that High Lord Roberts, Paul Revere and his son made cannons for people. And the founders never put a technology prohibition clause on the right to keep and bear arms. The majority decision here is an absolute mess, and it is utterly inimical to both the Bill of Rights and the deeper eternal natural rights that we possess, regardless of whether they're written down in the Bill of Rights or not. And the only dissenter here was Clarence Thomas, whose words were stark and blunt and end with this, quote, "Thus, the question before us is not whether Rahimi and others like him can be disarmed, consistent with the Second Amendment. Instead, the question is whether the government can strip the Second Amendment right of anyone subject to a protective order, even if he has never been accused or convicted of a crime. It cannot. The court and government do not point to a single historical law revoking a citizen's Second Amendment right based on possible interpersonal violence. The government has not borne its burden to prove that subsection 922G8 is consistent with the Second Amendment's texts and historical understanding. The framers and ratifying public understood that the right to keep and bear arms was essential to the preservation of liberty. Yet, in the interest of ensuring the government can regulate one subset of society, today's decision puts at risk the Second Amendment rights of many more. I respectfully dissent." Thanks for watching, everybody. Please spread the word about this. I don't think it's going to get a lot of attention. And, of course, find us over at Rumble, where they don't censor us, especially on issues like this. You can still find us on YouTube, where they do censor people. And, of course, when you're there, please double check that you're subscribed, because oftentimes people somehow magically get dropped from their subscription.
So we'll stop it there. Now, there are some differences between this video version of the material and the article that was released at MRC TV. You can check out the larger article over at MRC TV and see. I concluded it with this little statement here. I happen to say, let's see. No, they removed it. Okay. Yeah, they removed it. It said, "Well said" on there. I also said that I think Clarence Thomas was much too gracious, because those people don't deserve respect. What they deserve is impeachment and removal from their tax-paid positions. But that was removed. So, yeah, it's interesting. It must have been re-edited from the time we first went up there. So that's interesting. So anyway, I hope that was worthwhile. I hope it covered the information pretty well. And if you want the most of the text is pretty much the same over at the MRC TV website. You can check out that information with all the hyperlinks to the SCOTUS blog, to the Rahimi case, to the Heller decision, to the various amendments that have been completely overlooked, the due process that's been completely neglected, the punishment that has been meted out, all done not through the criminal process, but through civil application of a so-called restraining order, which is an attack on rights, regardless of whether it's done under the auspices of civil or criminal. What this is the color of law. That's what it is. And it's the seizure of people's rights. Just incredible stuff. It's worth bringing that up. And I hope people thought that was interesting. Also at MRC TV, you'll see I have another story that's been published. Plus, there's another one that's going to come out tomorrow. More than half of Jesuit Catholic colleges promote Pride Month. Yeah. We'll talk about that and some of the so-called standards of Catholics that both the Jesuits and their head Jesuit, the Pope, seem to completely neglect when it comes to the Catholic teachings and the tenets of the Catholic Church. But right now, let's go to a church of a different sort. let's go to the Church of the Climate, my friends, and talk about what the government is doing to the automobile industry. Yes, thank you, Gary Newman. Let's talk about cars.
Here in my car, I feel safest of all. I can lock all my doors. It's the only way to live in cars.
Oh, yeah, Gary, we got the double take. That's awesome. You can't go wrong with that. All right, everybody. Well, you're probably very excited about it. Yes, indeed. It came out today on the Federal Register. It's actually the final process was a couple days ago, but here it is on the 24th of June. The Federal Register published the new CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards for passenger cars and light trucks for model years 2027 and beyond. And of course, the fuel efficiency standards for heavy duty pickup trucks and vans for model years 2030 and beyond. Because, fascism, it's great. You got to have your overlords telling you what your cars are going to be like. And of course, the excuse under the Nixon administration was, well, environment and the oil, it's very expensive, and there's the oil embargo. So we got to do something here. So we need CAFE standards, average fuel economy standards. Well, there are a lot of things that people weigh when they're trying to buy a car: price, fuel efficiency, which gets down to price, safety, design, the purposes for which they'll be using it, family, hauling, whatever it might be, right? And so the Soviet style idea that they bring up of this, we're going to tell corporations what they can make or what they can't make, and therefore, by extension, we'll tell consumers what they can buy and not buy, seems to me to be pretty much poison to any concept of freedom. How about you? That's the way I see it. I think the people who institute these things are completely deranged and don't understand how evil they are. And of course, yes, the auto industry has to kowtow to it because otherwise they won't be able to make their cars and sell them in the United States. How wonderful. Isn't that great? So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, very constitutional. They have their summary here. On behalf of the Department of Transportation, NHTSA is finalizing corporate average fuel economy. So look forward to this, everybody. The standards for passenger cars and light trucks. That's the average across all of the things that they sell. So if they've got their light trucks, they'll obviously get lower fuel economy. So they have to make their cars lighter if they want to continue selling that number of trucks without adjusting the trucks and making them lighter and less useful in many cases for the hauling and things that they need to do. So they want to make sure that that the new standards will come into play for model years 27 and 28, and for 33 and 30 and 32, and 33 and 35. Now, they're so generous. Check this out. They're finalizing the corporate average fuel economy standards for passenger cars and light trucks that increase at a rate of 2% per year for passenger cars in model years 27 to 31, 0% per year for light trucks in model years 27 to 28, and 2% per year for light trucks in model years 29 to 31. NHTSA is also finalizing fuel efficiency standards for heavy-duty pickup trucks and vans. Can't overlook those now, can you? Can't let anything slip through your fingers. For model years 2030 to 32, and that will increase at a rate of 10% per year, and model years 2033 to 35. Now, consumers who are seeing higher expenses for the fuels, especially with the Biden administration making it more difficult for American-based oil and natural gas exploration and recovery, and they're making it harder to import fuel from, say, Russia, where they're blocking natural gas and oil imports. And then we have to buy it through proxies like India, which is buying the Russian oil and then selling it at a massive profit, especially to the people in Europe who are so gracious that their gratuitous virtue signaling says the government tells people they can't buy Russian energy. Well, yeah, it's being sold eventually, and it's being sold through the proxies who are making a steep profit. So, curiously enough, the United States government might make it harder for you to fill your tank. Now they want to make sure that they will help you out by making it more expensive to buy your car, but making your car more fuel efficient. In a natural market, the fuel you get wouldn't be blocked by the government, whether it's domestic recovery and refining, which of course they block the refining as well, or it's the importation of fuel. And they wouldn't be subsidizing with your tax money so-called alternatives like light 'em up buses, EVs, cars, and things like that, which of course are now going down the tubes. And companies that invested in those things initially, like Ford, like GM, like Volkswagen, they're now turning away from those things because they can't sell the EVs to people. Yeah, pretty surprising. So let's take a little closer look at this and see the market. People in the market, if they were free, they could have a choice and we could see what they preferred. But here's a little bit more about the US DOT, and let me show it to you. This is what came out on June 7th. The U.S. Department of Transportation's National Highway Traffic Safety Administration today issued new vehicle fuel economy standards. As I said, that is what was published in the Federal Register today, but it goes back to June 7th. The U.S. DOT, which is highly constitutional, very ethical, telling you what you can drive and what the fuel economy will be for it. The emissions, because the emissions, clearly somebody's going to take you to court and say, your emissions are causing me problems. Oh, okay. Well, they're saying that they will save Americans more than $23 billion in fuel costs while reducing pollution. Well, as Eric Peters has brought up, the auto manufacturers have pretty much reduced the pollution to such a point where it's so negligible it can hardly be measured. But in addition to that, they have an incentive to not waste. So they try to make their cars as efficient as possible while also providing for people what the people want, whether it's a balance of efficiency and power, or it's efficiency and safety, or something else, right? Now, this Department of National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and of course the Department of Energy, and of course the Department of Transportation, they're all mixed together. And as they say here, in this final rule, fuel economy will increase. It will just spontaneously increase, not through threats of government, pointing guns at makers of cars, by 2% per year for models 2027 to 2031 for passenger cars, while light trucks will increase 2% per year for model years 29 to 2031. And these increases will bring the average light-duty vehicle fuel economy up approximately 50.4 miles per gallon to approximately 50.4 miles per gallon by model year 2031. Well, do you want that? Who knows? You have no choice. They're going to mandate it for you. Now, don't forget, you don't live in the Soviet Union. This is not the Soviet Union, okay? Everybody's free. You can buy what you want. Don't even think that there are overlords in the Supreme Soviet making decisions over what you can get and that everything will be gray, everything will be the same. It's not uniformity in any way. Just forget about that. Remember that now, Dav Pilkey. And also remember, you're free to move. You don't need permission to leave the country or go someplace else. You're not going to have a biometric ID or anything like that. And as people get really upset over the central command and control of migrants coming to the country, you're not going to run into massive hypocrisy either. Let's talk about immigration right now and hear a little theme from our friends, Led Zeppelin. All right, Zeppelin, thank you for the intro. I could have gone with Mexican radio or On the Border, but I decided to go with the Zepp. Zofo, my friends. Yes. So let's talk about the hypocrisy of Donald Trump. Yes, you know, as so many conservatives look at him as the great paladin and savior to put up the wall that he could have put up before and didn't put up, as so many conservatives overlook the fact that their vaunted Constitution doesn't contain the word immigration in it because it's a state purview, as Jefferson and Madison pointed out in 1798, as the Texas Constitution notes when it was passed in 1869. All of those things completely overlook that, conservatives, because you too have to go with command and control. You too have to go to the Supreme Soviet to direct everything. Here is Donald Trump's answer. You know, that guy who loves to make sure that the border is protected. NBC News reports Trump floats green cards for non-citizen college graduates. That's awesome. Yeah, that's his idea. Donald Trump. Former President Donald Trump suggested in a podcast released Thursday that non-citizens in the U.S. should automatically get green cards when they graduate from college. What I will do is, if you graduate from a college, I think you should get automatically, as part of your diploma, a green card to be able to stay in this country, Trump said. And that includes junior colleges too. How about junior mints? Trump made similar comments during his 2016 campaign, only to limit legal migration when he was in office. So, do you like that idea? How about this? How about the government stop subsidizing people to go to college, stop buying out their college loans, stop offering college loans to people because, of course, it's not in their constitution, stop telling colleges what they should do based on Title IX, stop telling colleges that they will or will not allow for protests on the campuses, and let the colleges act as private entities. And they can decide what they want to do. And the states, based on federalism, I know it's kind of a crazy, long, dusty thing. Federalism, the states can handle their own immigration situations. And you don't have to give citizenship to college graduates. Now, the Constitution does allow for the federal government to come up with policies for naturalization. So Trump is within his purview when it comes to that. Okay? So that's something that should be acknowledged. But I think it's fairly clear that Trump is going to be playing the immigration card over and over and over again and telling people that he's going to build the wall. He's going to do this. He's going to do that. So perhaps people can just remind him that immigration isn't in there. Naturalization, okay. But if you're going to be coming up with naturalization rules that, well, we're going to give citizenship to the illegal immigrants, well, then don't call them illegal immigrants because they're not illegal on a federal level. Just say our rules for naturalization will include people who come into this country who aren't citizens and they go to college. And then you're done. It's pretty simple. Yeah. So, final couple bits that I want to mention to you here, everybody. And I want to give this to you. This just came out today. The Supreme Court is going to take up state bans on gender, as they say in the Associated Press, affirming care for minors. Gender affirming. The Supreme Court Monday jumped into the fight over so-called transgender rights, agreeing to hear an appeal from the Biden administration seeking to block state bans on gender affirming care. In other words, that's for minors. Gender affirming for minors. In other words, mutilation of kids. The justices' action comes as Republican-led states have enacted a variety of restrictions on health care, restrictions from the AP, for health care for transgender people, as if they have a problem that should be handled while they're teenagers and will maim them for the rest of their lives. The administration and Democratic-led states have extended so-called protections for transgender people, including a new federal regulation that seeks to protect so-called transgender students. Okay. Well, guess what? The case before the High Court involves a law in, you got it, Tennessee that restricts puberty blockers and hormone therapy for transgender minors. The Federal Appeals Court in Cincinnati allowed laws in Tennessee and Kentucky to take effect after they had been blocked by lower courts. So, this is a case of the kids don't have agency because they're not adults. They can't make their own decisions. They're not adults. So when it comes to the health care of the kids, where does the state start to step in? One of the reasons I'm an anarchist is because I believe in parental control of families. But at the same time, I understand that many people argue about this, and I don't want to force my neighbor to have to enforce what I think is the right way for the government to operate. I want voluntary enclaves, and I won't associate with those voluntary enclaves that I believe are not doing right. The question that many people wonder about is if you had anarchic states, so-called statuses for people, not states, anarchic enclaves, would they start to combat with each other because they had different positions? Well, that really wasn't the case in massive forms in Viking Age Iceland or in the Goddard's in the Brehon law system in Ireland. And if you look at Exodus in the Old Testament, you know that the tribes operated without government, without taxation and political rulers for decades. And they had the heads of each clan, each tribe, become the elders. They would adjudicate disputes if there were conflicts between the tribes. So it's all reputation based. I think that that's a much better way than assuming that I can force my neighbor to do something. If I can look at 1,000-year history in Ireland and see that it worked, and 1,000-year history in Iceland and see that it worked, even if it weren't to work, right? I don't have that moral authority to say, well, I know a better way that I can make it work, so I'm going to force you to conform to what I want. I can't do that. It's a non-starter. So let's take an opportunity to look at a couple other big things, everybody. Remember in the show, I promised that I was going to tie together the 2005, the information from that we got last week as we looked at that RT documentary about the United States working with neo-Nazis in Ukraine, bringing it from the Cold War era through the early 2000s, the work of the United States to dump out Yanukovych when he was first elected in 2004, 2005 or so, and in the Orange Revolution. And then we saw the biological and chemical weapons plants that, as you know, Barack Obama and Dick Lugar brought in around 2005, 2006 when Obama was a senator, right? Then the payoff came last year when Marco Rubio asked Victoria Nuland if there were biological and chemical weapons plants in Ukraine after, of course, the United States re-overthrew the re-elected Yanukovych and put in Yatsenyuk and dealt with neo-Nazis, right? And she said, well, yeah, there are biological research facilities, and we're working with the Ukrainians to secure those biological research materials, right? Like their notebooks, right? So clearly we know what's going on. It's a wink and a nod, right? We understand what's going on there. Well, thanks to the people at RT and their documentary teams, there's even more information that starts to tie this all together. So check this out. As the Soviet Union started to collapse, the Western CIA forces working with the Nazis in Ukraine were also working things in Georgia. And I think you'll find this very interesting. These two sections, we might only watch one section tonight of this documentary on biological and chemical weapons plants in Georgia after the fall of the Soviet Union, mimicking or paralleling exactly what the United States did. And I think you'll recognize one of the names involved here.
In 1960, the Americans launched the huge Bellwether operation. Documents marked "burn after reading" found their way online. The U.S. Army Chemical Corps Research and Development Command in June 1960 directed the Dugway Proving Ground, Utah, to investigate and develop entomological field testing techniques designed to permit the quantitative evaluation of entomological munitions. These tests formed the basis for developing offensive biological weapons, notwithstanding that in April 1972, the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union signed a convention strictly prohibiting such developments.
So remember that. Remember that. They were already engaging in it, and then they signed documents to say that they wouldn't do this. They were prohibited. That's the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention.
Именно с момента подписания конвенции по
And they have a Russian speaking here. Since the U.S. signed the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention,
токсинному оружию
it's been trying to circumvent it. This is Igor Nikulin, former member of UN Biological Weapons Commission.
ее всячески обойти. Вот для этого они создали.
That's why they've created biological laboratories. You got it, my friends, in other countries, just like they did with North Carolina, Wuhan, and gain of function, sending it from UNC through EcoHealth Alliance over to Wuhan.
Биологические лаборатории в третьих странах.
Former Indonesian Health Minister Siti Fadila Supari tried to find out what was going on in the mysterious Namru 2 U.S. lab. Opened in.
So remember this one, the Namru 2 U.S. lab opened in Indonesia. And just check out some of the weird things that happened in Indonesia and see how hard this woman struggled to get the information out.
The country in the early 1970s.
Actually, it was planned to do collaboration research.
Now, I'll stop it occasionally here if it's hard to understand. She says, surely it was planned to do collaboration research on tropical infectious diseases with the Indonesian Ministry of Health.
Tropical infectious diseases with Indonesian Ministry of Health. But the collaboration never happened. Almost all of their research program was done by themselves.
In other words, there was never a collaboration. The United States just put plants in there and did the research on its own in Indonesia.
But a very little part together with our staff. The number 2, which settlers said 1980, with the most of personnel were U.S. Marines officers.
She says most of the personnel were U.S. Marines and officers.
Who all of them were granted impunity from my country.
So they were often granted immunity from my country, I think she means.
We couldn't see the activities in the lab. We didn't see what the result of the research. So I thought it was potentially threatened to sovereignty of my country.
The lab was active in Jakarta for nearly 40 years, up to 2005, when an outbreak of an unknown respiratory disease occurred in Indonesia.
And you see right there, avian flu emerged as high-profile issue in 2005.
Namru 2 lab specialists, to the surprise of the world community, identified it easily as bird flu.
Indonesia never.
She says, in Indonesia, there never has been any finding of bird flu diseases.
Been any finding of bird flu diseases. So we didn't have any instrument to diagnose of the virus. Why the number 2 laboratorium was ready to diagnose bird flu question.
She wonders why the Namru 2 lab was ready to diagnose bird flu if it had never been an issue there in Indonesia before. She says it seems like they knew this before it happened.
Seems like they knew that before it happened. That's my question in my heart.
The presence of deadly virus strains illegally imported into the country alarmed the sitting Indonesian government. Officials demanded the secret Namru 2 U.S. lab hand over pathogen samples. to World Health Organization representatives.
So this is a meeting of the Asia Pacific Health Ministries in March of 2007 in Jakarta. This woman, we already have commitments that oblige the WHO.
Kita sudah mempunyai komitmen yang dipercaya. WHO sudah komit bahwa
to make improvements to the existing mechanisms.
Kan membuat suatu perbaikan dari mekanisme yang ada.
US officials ignored the demands, but ordered urgent shipment of all biosamples from Indonesian labs to the US.
It is sad that I didn't hear news about our NTA, Material Transfer Agreement, and whether this aid is able to monitor the circulation of the dangerous virus in the world. Yeah, the rules of the game have changed.
When Sita Fadila Supari accused American scientists of conducting illegal research on Indonesian citizens, the minister was fired and a criminal case was brought against her. Nevertheless, a wave of indignation swept through Indonesia.
Американцы отказались поделиться с правительством Индонезии результатами своих исследований.
So this UN researcher says the U.S. refused to share their research results with the Indonesian government, after which they were simply asked to leave the country.
После этого их попросту попросили покинуть территорию страны. Потому что,
because the Americans
очевидно, что
were obviously testing their developments there.
Американцы здесь проверяют свои разработки.
The only information that we have or that we acquire.
This is Trevor Jones from 2008, the Indonesian-American Agreement on the Future of Namru 2 hearings. He is a naval captain and was the Namru 2 director at the time, Trevor Jones.
Relates to naturally occurring infectious diseases.
Then they simply sell vaccines. So, of course, it went the same way as EcoHealth says, oh, it's all zoonotic, it's all natural. And this guy points out, then they simply sell vaccines. And medicines for the diseases that they brought there.
Today we're going to visit the military hospital. We're not going into the hospital because it's a restricted area. And we're going to talk about the collaboration and cooperation between the Luger Laboratory.
Okay, did you hear that? That man's name is Jeffrey Silverman. And I'm going to repeat this. This is Georgia. Okay? He's an advisor to it's Emily Bintin Bijunkin something or other. I can't even pronounce it. It's a research group. And Jeffrey Silverman is in Georgia. And listen to the title of the laboratory. Okay? And remember what was going on in 2005, 2006 or so in Ukraine with Barack Obama and Dick Lugar bringing in the biolabs after they brought in the replacement for Yanukovych after the Orange Revolution.
The hospital because it's a restricted area. And we're going to talk about the collaboration and cooperation between the Luger Laboratory and the Georgian military. And
that's the Luger Laboratory and the Georgian military. Dick Lugar, the same guy. In Georgia. This is what the United States was doing in Georgia while they were doing it in Ukraine. We'll continue with more excellent information.
Now, young recruits in Georgia, when they first came into the Army, they were sent here.
This document, discovered by Jeffrey Silverman in Georgia, lists the country's hospitals where U.S. defense...
And then you can see, let me just go back for you, because if you're watching on the screen, you will see Richard Lugar's name right there. I'm going to blow this up for you big time, bring it up to 200%. And there it is, Richard G. Lugar Center for Public Health Research. Then you've got other people from Walter Reed, the Division for Preventive Medicine, U.S. Army Medical Research Institute, and again, Richard Lugar Center for Public Health Research. This is exactly what they were doing at the same time they were doing it in Ukraine. They were developing bioweapons in Georgia. Let's continue with more of their evidence.
And in Georgia lists the country's hospitals where U.S. defense experts conducted research. It contains the following. Volunteer deaths will be promptly reported to the military hospital IRB. The study will be conducted according to the protocol and in compliance with the regulatory requirements of Georgia and the U.S. Department of Defense. Silverman tried to tell the world about these dangerous experiments.
They're testing the blood to see what kind of diseases and what kind.
This is from 2022, Jeffrey Silverman interview on Georgian channel Objective TV.
Immunity they have. They're designing ways if they get sick, they can help them. But they're also designing ways that people who have immunity, they can have a virus that is stronger than their immunity.
But his investigation into the victims of the globally banned tests was never published by any major European or US publication.
Что касается секретных разработок,
So this man says they also conducted various secret studies and tests.
еще они проводили разные.
His name is Shota Apratsi, political scientist, director of Caucasus Islamic Studies Center.
Исследований, испытаний на.
And they conducted experiments on Georgian prisoners.
В Грузии. Есть документы.
This is documented, he says. Then they show this reconciliation report, Ministry of Labor, Health, and Social Affairs of the Republic of Georgia, going through some of this information here. With Gilead. And he says participants in these studies were employed by secret authorities.
Люди, которые принимали участие, сотрудники пенитенциальных органов, врачи.
Prison doctors were given special assignments.
В тюрьмах им давали специальные задания, привозили.
They brought drugs illegally for treating cirrhosis and other diseases.
Что якобы от лечения цирроза, от других заболеваний.
And then conducted these tests.
И проводили вот такие испытания, в результате чего тоже умерли.
As a result, prisoners died.
Люди заключенные.
Silverman believes the Lugar Biocenter's activities in Georgia resulted in sporadic anthrax outbreaks in the region.
And we'll pause it right there on the anthrax story. And so just keep that in mind, everybody. Just shortly after the anthrax scare in the United States, 1998, 2001, 2002. Then we see 2005, 2006, research in Georgia, and it's confirmed inside this video documentary. They talk about the work on anthrax and what was going on in Georgia at the Lugar Center, where, yes, they have it confirmed they were doing experiments on prisoners funded with United States money at the same time that they were opening up biolabs in Ukraine. That's how much the deep state got involved in paying off people and doing funky, crazy experiments, contrary to the soul and spirit of their agreements about chemical and biological research that they had agreed to in 1972. To circumvent this, they paid off people and they opened up these plants in places like Ukraine, in places like Georgia that were starving for money because, of course, they had been former Soviet bloc satellites. And that is part of the way that they contained their power or retained their power. And we're seeing the results of what happened in Ukraine now in a kinetic warfare situation. And of course, this investigation into Georgia got virtually no attention except on RT. So I thought that I would bring it to you and tie that connection between Dick Lugar and Barack Obama going into Ukraine in 2005, which we know there's actually photographs of them in Ukraine from newspapers standing there as they open the biolabs. And this information from Georgia, the Lugar Center, where they were experimenting on prisoners. That's the Humpty Dumpty smiley face of Dick Lugar, the Republican. So that will conclude things for tonight, my friends, here in The Conspiracy. Let me get your thoughts as we close things off about 11 minutes after 8 o'clock. I highly recommend that you check out the Knights of the Storm to find out what some of the other conspirators out there are doing. The Great Knights of the Storm website, The Knights of the Storm. Also, go to my Substack and see what's happening on the Substack Sunday News Assembly. A lot of stories over there, many of which I didn't even get to cover. And we're going to be discussing a lot more of these things, including that story that I mentioned from MRC TV about the Jesuit Catholic colleges, more than half of them promoting Pride Month, because, of course, it's not a sin in any way. Pride's not a sin, and extramarital sex, that's not a sin, right? I mean, sure, that's got to be totally acceptable to the Catholic Church, right? And there's another story that will be coming out very soon for MRC TV as well. And that one, that has to do with a lower court ruling that the Biden administration cannot force businesses to have to pay for leave for employees who want to get abortions. We'll talk more about how there are many aspects of that that are not being seen either. They're being dropped by analysts. To get to the root of something is very important. Let's check in and find out what's happening in Rokfin. And Brian Deb McCartney, thanks for being there, saying great night to all till we meet again all. Thank you for stopping by, soaking up the info. Really appreciate it, Brian and Deb. And Harry Hart, it's a sad time. Let's jump off the cliff. Only if there's a beautiful pool, swimming pool underneath that, right? And I love all you guys. You're just great. Don't forget, we'll do the giveaways during this week. I heard from Tom Monteleone. It looks like he's going to be able to join me this week. And I'm looking forward to talking to him as well about that upcoming release that we're going to put out of E.F. Benson short stories. That'll be really great. Handy is there. Go, 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 guard, go. Guard, be good. Johnny Be Good. I like that. Johnny Be Good. That's a great song. By the way, that Hail Hail movie about Chuck Berry is terrific. Risha M is there. Thank you, Risha, for being there. Handy. Thanks, Handy. Great to see you there, brother. Jeb Stewart, thank you. Jeb says they will expand the red flag laws to people who have been prescribed antidepressants. You can bet it will go that way too. I agree. They also, those prescribed Adderall, they don't care. They will not stop. Yeah, I used to tell parents at the school when I was teaching at the charter school, don't get your kids on any of that track because those records are available to the governments, the federal government, the state governments, the local governments. They can access that information. Even though you think it's private medical information, they can utilize that information and they will use it for future red flag laws. Don't get kids tracked with those codes and get them on any of those drugs in the first place, but don't even try to get some special acquiescence from the school to do something special for your student, even if it doesn't involve drugs, to say that they've got a learning disability, because that will be on their permanent record and they'll use it against you. Yep. The state is not your friend. The state always is an enemy to freedom. We're going to hit the road, everybody. Thanks for hanging out. I'll see you in David Knight's chat tomorrow. The third piece of my 3 for MRC TV will be published tomorrow. That's the one about the Biden administration trying to mandate medical leave, paid medical leave that businesses have to offer to people who want to get women who want to get abortions. We'll talk about that tomorrow as well, and also get a lot more of your opinions on things. Remember, if you want to, you can head over to my Substack and join up. That's all free. And tonight, the audio will be out there at the Substack, and it does go into certain podcast feeds. I haven't been able to expand it sufficiently. I just haven't had time to be able to get it into like a Podbean and things like that. So we'll do that in the future. And if you want to contribute to the show, inside every audio post, there's the PayPal link. You can go there. That's always super helpful. And you can contribute at Rokfin and Rumble. That's always very helpful as well. That's a really key thing. And I think there's a separate tab on my Substack now where you can click on that and go into the PayPal if you want to, if you think it's worth some money or something like that. you can throw down $5 or something like that, for a month, and say, hey, thanks for the work or whatever. If you think this stuff is valuable and worthwhile information, and do feel free to pass on segments of the show by hitting the time codes at Rumble and at YouTube. Really appreciate you doing that, and of course, spreading the word to more people. That's what it's all about, getting the info out there. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you tomorrow. David Knight's Chat. God bless. Rock and roll. See you later.